Built in 1872, publicly hailed as a progressive sanctuary for the mentally unwell. Privately, a cruciform temple designed by men who understood the power of architecture not for healing but for containment, and not of madness but of something far older, something buried in the soil long before the first stone was laid. They called it the Ridge, not just because it stood high, but because things once crawled beneath it. Things that whispered through floorboards and threaded lullabies into the lungs of sleeping children. The chimneys burned day and night, not for warmth, but for purification. Boiled linens, yes, and bones. Do not mistake the faint smell of old milk and damp rust that clings to those walls. It isn't mildew, it's memory. You see, there's a reason why Danvers inspired H.P. Lovecraft, why it echoes in the DNA of Arkham Asylum, why its blueprint shows up in institutions across the country. Because Danvers wasn't an anomaly. It was a prototype, a sacred geometry of control, brick laid upon brick in deliberate alignment to house something ancient and unspoken, not just the mad, but the forgotten, the unwanted, the sacrificed. You've been taught that asylums were built to save people. The truth? They were built to store secrets. And tonight, I'm going to take you inside, not just into Danvers, but into the undercurrent of every haunted sanitarium across America, from Waverly to Trans-Allegheny, from Pennhurst to Willard. What you're about to hear is not entertainment. It's a warning. Because once you learn what these walls remember, you don't come back the same. Now, look behind you. Not physically, spiritually. Because this story isn't starting. It's returning. Are you ready? You've been told the past is behind you, that history is a trail of events neatly archived, safely buried under plaques and plaques of progress. But there are places, like Danvers, where history isn't buried. It breathes, slowly, patiently, like a thing waiting in the walls, remembering every name, especially the ones that were never spoken aloud. Danvers didn't start with a blueprint. It started with a death. The hillside where it was built was once a public execution ground in the days of Salem's long shadow. Blood watered that soil for decades before anyone thought to heal on it. But they didn't remove the gallows. They just built over them. They didn't rebuke the curse. They institutionalized it. You see, the asylum was laid in a cruciform, a perfect cross, each wing a limb of sacrifice. That wasn't by accident. That was by design. These architects weren't just builders. They were initiates, members of old orders that understood how trauma embeds in geometry, how pain can be harnessed through alignment. They say patients came here to forget, but the walls never did. Every corridor in Danvers was mapped to mirror the stages of disintegration, not healing. From hydrotherapy to seclusion to chemical compliance. It was a machine of silence. A place where names were taken and identities dissolved. But it wasn't madness they were erasing. It was memory. Records tell us of a woman, Abigail Dorsey, committed for melancholia. Neighbors found her in her garden humming lullabies to empty cradles carved into the earth. When she was brought to Danvers, she repeated one sentence. He is under the floorboards. Again and again. And then she vanished. No escape, no body, just a blanket folded like hospital ritual demands, with a single strand of hair, still warm. Nurses claimed her mouth kept moving after dusk, whispering something no one could hear. Abigail was not mad. She remembered too much. And that's the first truth you must understand. Madness was not an illness here. It was a sentence. A veil pulled over those who saw too clearly, who remembered the wrong things, who spoke names that institutions fought to erase. Danvers didn't cure, it consumed, and once it marked you, it never let go. Now tell me, have you felt it? That hum beneath your skin since we began? That isn't imagination, it's inheritance. By the winter of 1873, only a year after Danvers opened its doors, the orderlies refused to walk the east wing after sunset. They claimed the floorboards grew warm, alive almost, beneath their boots. Some said it was the old pipes. Others whispered about something breathing underneath. But listen carefully. Pipes don't breathe in rhythm. They don't exhale grief. That wing had been built directly above the old gallows slope, the place where the hangman's rope sang its last lullaby. No matter how much concrete they poured, no matter how many prayers the chapel offered, the ground remembered. It pulsed. They tried to hide it behind brick and linoleum with bright new lamps and fresh paint, but patients still saw it, heard it, felt it. Some nights, there would be tapping behind the plaster, always in threes. 3 knocks, silence, then 3 more, a question, and God help the ones who answered. One young nurse, Ruth Eames, confided in her journal that she heard someone calling her name through the walls, not yelling, whispering, with affection, with hunger. Ruth disappeared after a double shift. All they found was her name scratched into the underside of her own cot, over and over, like a child trying to remember itself. Now think, why would a structure designed for healing be built atop centuries of death? Unless that was the point. They say the architecture of a place holds the intention of its creators. A church holds prayer. A slaughterhouse, fear. Danvers? Danvers was built to store despair. 4 wings stretching from a central rotunda, just like a dissected body on a slab. The air vents placed not for function, but for surveillance. Every hallway curved just enough to keep you uncertain of what was behind you. The windows too narrow to escape, but just wide enough to reflect your own distorted silhouette. And still, that warmth rose from the floor. That sickening scent of milk left too long in a child's bottle. That breath. Because you must understand, these institutions were not made to trap the sick. They were made to feed on them, to siphon grief like oil, to hold memory like a vault, to draw power from suffering. This is not exaggeration. This is design. And Danvers was only the beginning. By spring, the snow began to thaw, but the ground didn't settle. Orderlies reported that the earth itself seemed wrong. Groves where trees should bloom stood blackened. Mud paths buckled where no frost should remain, but it was the western slope that haunted them most. A perfect ring of dead trees, encircling a sunken patch of earth. No blueprints listed it, no landscaping records mentioned it, no grave markers, no chapel blessings, just a hollow, like the land had exhaled something terrible. They told themselves it was just erosion, until the patients began to murmur. At first it was gibberish, dream talk, then repetition, over and over with cold lips and closed eyes they whispered it. The hollow is never empty. Doctors dismissed it as suggestion, a contagion of the mind. They said madness could leap like a flame, one bed to the next. But what kind of madness speaks in perfect unison? What kind of madness scratches at the window panes only when you're alone? One nurse, Mabel Quinn, told the matron she saw something small move beneath the surface of that sunken earth. Just a ripple, like a child shifting beneath a blanket. The next day, she resigned. She was found at the edge of town hours later, digging into the frost-bitten soil with bare hands, whispering a name no one recognized. Her fingers bled. Her eyes bled. But she wouldn't stop. She said she had to make room. The hollow was never empty, she cried. It just needed more space. Do you understand? These asylums weren't built on haunted ground. They were built to awaken it, to stir what lay sleeping with human suffering, to call it forth with the music of unspoken trauma and institutional silence. That's why the architecture echoes across the country. That's why the symbols scratched into the plaster reappear, no matter how many times they're scrubbed away. Danvers wasn't cursed. It was commissary. Ironed. A facility for the forgotten and the unborn. And when you stand on that western slope, if you're quiet, you might hear them moving. Beneath, still waiting, still humming lullabies made of dirt and time, still asking to be remembered. Not all ghosts wear hospital gowns. Some wear white coats. Dr. Thaddeus Murnane arrived at Danvers in 1881 with impeccable credentials, Harvard-trained, battlefield-hardened, and fluent in 7 languages, including Latin, Greek, and something he simply called pre-Roman. No one questioned it. He was charming, brilliant, polite in the way venom is polite before it kills. His proposal to the board was simple: isolation breeds madness. But if you could sever the memory, not just the pain, perhaps the soul could be rewired, renewed. The state approved his funding, and so began what the staff quietly called the tapering, a series of undocumented treatments conducted in the sealed lower levels of the hospital, levels that no longer appear on any official floor plan. Murnane claimed he could reduce any human to a neutral state, a perfect blank slate, no grief, no memory, no identity, just a vessel. What did he mean by that? No one dared ask, because patients began to return from Murnane's care. Different, quieter, too quiet. One nurse described it as like watching someone wear a skin they hadn't grown into yet. They blinked too slowly, smiled too widely, and when they spoke, it wasn't always in English. One orderly quit on the spot after hearing a woman recite what sounded like ancient Sumerian, backwards. They asked Murnane if he had any record of her treatment. He smiled and said she had never existed. And the terrifying part? There was no record. He had erased her so completely, even her birth certificate was gone. One winter morning, Murnane's office was found empty. No note, no sign of struggle, just his coat hanging on the back of his chair, and a single patient file left open, the name, his own. Since then, patients and staff have reported sightings of a man in a white coat walking the lower halls, always silent, never casting a shadow, and at Danvers, everyone heard the screams. It was almost expected, part of the night shift, like boiler checks and candle rounds. Some came from the infirmary, others echoed down from the attic dormitories, but there was one hallway, just one, where the screams didn't match any known voice. Not male, not female, not even animal. They called it Ward C. Officially, it was a locked-down section reserved for the most violent cases, those who'd attempted escape or murder. But former staff whisper a different truth, that no patient ever stayed long in Ward C, because none of them survived it. One nurse, a stout Irish woman named Annie Flynn, told her niece this before she died. It weren't the patient's screamin' child, it was the walls, as if they missed something that used to live inside 'em. Annie never spoke of it again. But late one October, 4 orderlies on rotation tried to prove her wrong. They brought a phonograph into the ward, not to soothe patients, but to record the screaming. One full night, just to settle a bet. What they captured? 3 minutes of static, then 17 seconds of something else. Not words, not cries, a rhythm, a pulse, like something massive breathing in reverse, and beneath that, a wet, clicking sound, like teeth on tile. The machine broke before dawn. Of the 4 men, only 2 returned to work. The 3rd jumped from the East Bell Tower 1 week later. The 4th. He was found in the furnace chamber, arms folded neatly, every tooth missing. No blood, no sign of violence, just an open mouth, frozen in awe or terror. After that, Ward C was sealed, brick by brick, not decommissioned, buried, and any reference to it in state records was crossed out in red. But sometimes, when the wind cuts from the east and the moon is just low enough, people walking near the foundation say they hear something, not screams, knocking, as if the bricks weren't holding something in, but keeping something out. Danvers didn't just contain madness, it invited it. And Ward C. In 1947, a new superintendent arrived at Danvers. Dr. Lewis Penhallow, clean-cut, science-driven, and deeply skeptical of the asylum's growing reputation for the unnatural. He dismissed talk of hauntings, secret floors, and voices in the plumbing as theatrics of the mentally fatigued. But he was methodical, obsessed with documentation. So he commissioned a full photographic survey of the asylum, from attic to sub-basement, every corridor, every ward, every locked cell. The team consisted of 2 state-appointed photographers with large-format cameras, instructed to use long exposures to capture even the dimmest corners of Danvers. What they developed never saw the light of day. Of the 462 images taken, 27 were pulled and sealed. And not because of patient privacy, because what was in them couldn't be explained. One photo, Ward A empty hallway, but in the image, a child-sized figure with no eyes, standing against the wall, facing it. When they returned to that hallway, nothing was there, but the photographer said he heard something whispering his name from inside the wall. Another photo, Operating Theater 2, a surgical gurney, nothing unusual, except the gurney was wet, covered in dark streaks, but the room had been clean, scrubbed. In the picture, a handprint, pressed into the metal, too large for any human. One more, a storage room in the west wing. The camera flash revealed something painted on the back wall, symbols, dozens of them, swirling in a spiral like a galaxy collapsing. None of them matched any known language, not Latin, not Greek, not even the strange pre-Roman script Dr. Murnane once mentioned. The original negatives were seized by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and never returned. But Penhallow kept copies, because something about them felt familiar. Years later, when his home was searched after his sudden death, investigators found a single room in the basement, walls covered in the symbols from the West Wing photograph, a mattress in the center, a locked trunk nearby. Inside the trunk, all 27 photographs, and a final note. I know what Danvers was built over, and it's waking up. None of the officers on that scene ever returned to law enforcement. One was committed to a facility that no longer exists on any map. The same fate, they say, that awaits anyone who looks too closely. Every building has a bottom, a floor that marks the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beneath it. But at Danvers State Hospital, there's a basement that doesn't exist on any blueprint. Not in state records, not in the architect's ledgers, not even in the monastery plans from the 1800s that Danvers was supposedly built over. And yet, orderlies whispered of a stairwell in the east wing, past the laundry chute, behind a rusted door with no handle. You could only open it by pulling, but no one ever remembered it being left ajar. They called it Level 1. The few who claimed to descend it said the temperature dropped by 15 degrees in 5 steps, that the stone underfoot wasn't concrete, but some older stone, grooved and porous like volcanic glass, and that the walls wept, not water, but something thicker, black, sticky, foul-smelling. One maintenance man, a veteran named Roy Kendrick, insisted he once had to change a burst pipe near that level. What he found? No burst pipe, but a well, an ancient shaft in the center of the floor, sealed with a rusted iron grate, not modern iron, hand-wrought, covered in carvings that twisted the longer you stared. He said it hummed, low, rhythmic, almost inviting. 2 weeks after the incident, Roy vanished. His wife said he'd stopped sleeping. He would sit in the corner of their bedroom, mumbling about the voices below the floor. On the night he disappeared, all she found was a black smear leading from the back door to the edge of the woods, like something had crawled or been dragged. Later, when state demolition crews arrived to deconstruct Danvers in the early 1990s, they found no access to level 1. The door was gone, not sealed. Gone. Just blank wall where it should have been. But here's what chills historians the most. Ground-penetrating radar did detect a space, not a room, but a hollow void, at nearly 90 feet beneath where the east wing once stood, perfectly circular, as if something built it from below and still waits there. Because not everything in Danvers was human. Some things never had skin to begin with. In the spring of 1952, a new patient arrived at Danvers State Hospital under a cloak of silence. Name, unknown. Age, roughly 10. File, redacted. Arrival, time, 3:11 a.m. Transported by unmarked black vehicle. No driver record, no intake signature. The staff simply called him Patient E. He didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't eat, yet never lost weight. Doctors at first assumed severe trauma, perhaps abuse, maybe an orphan from one of the many reform schools in the hills, but nothing about him matched any medical profile. His eyes were wrong, not in shape or color, but in how they moved, independently, constantly scanning the corners of rooms he wasn't facing, like they were watching something invisible moving through walls. When nurses approached, he would press his fingers to their lips and whisper, "Shh, it's listening. It hates loud hearts." Within a week, the first nurse quit. 2 others had seizures after prolonged exposure to him. Not epilepsy, just staring at him too long triggered convulsions, as if his presence rewired their brains. His room was locked from the outside, twice, but every morning it was open. And inside, drawn in charcoal along the walls, were spirals, identical to the ones found in the West Wing storage room years before. The doctors tried sedating him, but the drugs evaporated in the syringe before reaching his veins. Tried restraining him. The leather straps disintegrated overnight. They even attempted isolation underground, placing him in a padded cell far below the general wards. That's when the rats started dying. One by one, rodents from the sublevels were found stiff, twisted, faces frozen in terror, their skulls cracked from the inside. One of the janitors swore he saw a light, a blue pulse, coming from under the boy's door at night. Another described hearing a sound like glass screaming underwater. Then came the pew. Smart. At exactly 3:11 a.m. on the 13th day of his stay, every clock in Danvers stopped. Patients screamed in unison, and 4 staff members were found in a catatonic state, repeating only one phrase: "He is not a boy, he is a messenger." The next day, the room was empty. No signs of struggle. Just a spiral drawn in blood on the mattress, and a note pinned to the wall with a human tooth. You can't cure what came before man. The room was sealed. The file disappeared. But the spiral? It's still there, beneath the paint. And sometimes it glows in the dark. By 1937, Danvers State Hospital had too many mouths to feed and not enough hands to care. Patients slept in hallways. Bodies went unwashed for days. Doctors were burning out, and the lines between treatment and containment were beginning to blur. Then the whispers began. It started in Ward C, primarily elderly men with dementia. They claimed the ceiling was speaking Latin at night, not chanting, conversing. They said it was asking them questions. Questions like, "What did you bury in the orchard?" Whose bones lie beneath your tongue? At first, staff dismissed it as delirium. But when non-Latin speaking patients began muttering the same ancient phrases, flawlessly, it got attention. One night, a nurse named Clara Jensen recorded a patient during an episode. The tape was reviewed by Father Benedict, a Jesuit scholar from Boston College. He paled as he listened. The voice, though gravelly and low, was reciting a forbidden prayer from the Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible, a text thought to be locked in the Vatican's Black Archive. That tape burned in a fire the following week, but something worse lingered. The language spread like a virus. Soon, staff were muttering Latin in their sleep. One orderly was caught writing entire passages on the floor with his own fingernails, down to the bone, before he passed out from blood loss. The hospital called in CDC officials. They found no biological pathogen, but still, patients were changing. Some became violently silent, refusing to speak at all. Others developed mirror speech, only speaking backwards, in whispers that didn't match the movements of their mouths. One patient died choking on pages from the hospital Bible, pages that were never torn out, but somehow missing from every copy on the grounds. Even worse, a child in the children's ward who'd never spoken a word since his mother abandoned him, suddenly sane, owed up and screamed a phrase no one could translate, until a monk identified it as an exorcism in reverse. The night he spoke it, 10 crows smashed into the hospital windows on every floor. No explanation, no storm, no migration, just sudden black death falling from the sky. After that, Danvers sealed Ward C, bricked it up, pretended it never existed. But Latin still leaks from its walls in the winter when the wind is just right, and sometimes you can answer it. Not all who worked at Danvers were mad. Some were just desperate. Enter Dr. Ellis Graham, 1944. Harvard-trained, brilliant, charismatic, a rising star in psychiatric medicine, until a nervous breakdown during the war left him blacklisted from private practice. Danvers was his last resort. He began work in the South Wing, focusing on catatonic patients, those who didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even blink. The forgotten ones. The furniture, as crueler orderlies called them. But Dr. Graham didn't see furniture. He saw listeners, and he began speaking to them, not just in sessions, but alone, at night, after the halls went dark. He claimed they were not empty, just occupied. In time, strange things happened. Patients who hadn't moved in years began mirroring his gestures, a twitch of the hand, a tilt of the head. They never spoke, but they seemed aware, synchronized. Graham started recording these sessions, though no audio survives. What we have are pages from his private journal. One entry reads, "They're not patients, they're hosts, and they're waiting for the right name." That phrase, the right name, shows up repeatedly. And then one winter night, a breakthrough. Dr. Graham arrived for his midnight rounds and found all 17 catatonics in Ward E sitting up in bed, staring at him, smiling, every single one. He asked, trembling, "What changed?" They answered, in unison, "You finally called us by our name." And that name? He never wrote it down, only that it was not meant for ears made of flesh. The next morning, his office was empty. The tapes were gone. But his coat remained, draped over a patient's chair, and inside the pocket, a folded note written in 3 different handwritings. You can't treat ghosts, but you can give them a voice. After his disappearance, every catatonic patient in Ward E was transferred or died within 48 hours. Autopsies showed an identical anomaly in each, a tiny second tongue behind the original, pale, atrophied, useless, almost like it had never learned to speak. Danvers sealed off Ward E, painted over the door, changed the maps. But during demolition, workers uncovered a single recording, a reel-to-reel tape labeled Session 13. They spoke my name. When they played it, no voices, just 33 seconds of breathing. From inside the room. It was known only by whispers. Room 271, no record of it in blueprints, no mention in staff logs, no key ever issued. But every orderly knew the rumor. If you wandered the west corridor past 2 a.m., you might see a door that hadn't been there before. Peeling paint, brass handle, the number 271 carved, not painted, into the wood. Most ignored it. Some tried to open it, and a few, just a few, walked in. They never walked back out. In 1971, a janitor named Roberto Berto Delgado vanished during night cleanup. His cart was found outside Ward H. His flashlight sat beside it, still warm. The only trace of him was a red smear on the floor leading to a dead wall. The next night, his co-worker Darren went searching. He found no door, no blood, but he heard knocking, then sobbing. A man's voice whispering in Spanish, "Está atrapado, no hay tiempo." He called the police, but by the time they arrived, the voice was gone. A week later, 14-year-old patient Emily Rowe, nonverbal since birth, drew room 271 on her bedsheets using her own blood. A perfect sketch, including the number. And something else. Hands reaching from underneath the door, dozens of them, all facing the wrong way, palms inward, as if trying to keep something inside. The hospital psychiatrist accused her of fabrication. She smiled for the first time in her life and said 5 words, "It's not a door anymore." After that, the wall was torn down. No room behind it, just more wall. But a year later, during demolition, a crewman fell through a hollow space behind the west corridor. What he found? A single room, 7 by 7 feet. Inside, a rusted hospital bed, scratched walls, a doorknob embedded in the ceiling, and most horrifying, a mummified hand still clutching a clipboard that read, "Room 271, in use." They sealed it in concrete. No press, no records. But late at night, nurses claimed Usain would still hear scraping, like fingernails just behind the plaster. And when it rained hard enough, that number would bleed through the paint. The room that wasn't on any map, because it wasn't built. It was summoned, and it may still be calling. In most hospitals, the nursery is a place of hope. At Danvers State, it was a warning. They called it Ward 1, short for infants, but it wasn't always there. Before 1941, the hospital had no maternity services, no obstetricians, and certainly no reason to house newborns. But then, one winter night, a nurse heard crying in the abandoned West Wing. She followed the sound for nearly 20 minutes until she found a room with 12 bassinets, all empty, except one. Inside, a baby, pale, silent, eyes open, watching. There were no birth records, no admissions paperwork, no witnesses, just that single note scrawled on a blood-stained index card. He was born in the wall. From that night forward, they kept arriving, one by one, infants, appearing in cribs, on shelves, once even in a locked filing cabinet, always silent, always watching. Some nurses believed the babies were real. Others swore they weren't human. What frightened them most? None of them ever cried. Even when cut, even when burned by sterilization lights. No sound, no tears, just that same cold, ancient gaze. By 1944, Danvers staff assigned a permanent team to Ward 1. Every nurse lasted less than a week. One slit her own throat. Another vanished during a shift change, her shoes left neatly at the ward door. When the new superintendent tried to shut it down, they discovered something grotesque. None of the infants had navels. No belly button. No scar. No proof of ever having an umbilical cord. In other words, not born, made. That's when the Vatican stepped in. They sent Father Leone, a consultant in exorcisms and preternatural biology. He spent 3 hours in Ward 1 praying over each crib. When he left, he was shaking. His only words? These are not children. They are returns. The next day, every baby vanished. No footprints, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just 12 empty bassinets and a single phrase carved deep into the floorboards. Thank you for your sacrifice. Danvers shuttered Ward 1 forever. They bricked up the door. But nurses say that if you press your ear to that wall on Christmas Eve, you'll hear cooing, or worse, your name spoken in a voice that hasn't aged in 80 years. Danvers State Hospital was infamous for its maze-like corridors. But one hallway, the North Observation Passage, didn't just bend space, it bent time. Built during a 1937 expansion, this wing was intended for overflow patients deemed too docile for isolation, but too disturbed for general population. The hallway stretched 63 feet long, on paper. Yet staff noted something strange. Patients who entered for a 10-minute observation came out before they went in, not just metaphorically, literally. One nurse, Patricia Halding, wrote in her shift log, patient number 1193 entered observation corridor at 3:42 p.m., returned to chair at 3:37 p.m. They repeated the test, again and again, each time watches reversed. Clocks froze. Heartbeat monitors skipped backward. It wasn't just time bending, it was unraveling. Then came the experiment they never reported publicly. They sent in a patient named Clarence Rowe, a 47-year-old who hadn't spoken a word in 6 years. They equipped him with a stopwatch, a body camera, and an EEG monitor. He walked in. 3 minutes passed. But when he stepped out, he was 5 years younger. Hair thicker, wrinkles faded, dental scars gone. Even more chilling, he could speak again, but only in Old English. He said only one phrase, "The father of clocks waits beneath the crawl." Then he collapsed, and aged 5 years in 5 seconds. Heart stopped. Autopsy revealed nothing, not even brain trauma, just a faint residue in the blood. Antimony, mercury, lead, all common in medieval alchemy. 2 days later, the hallway sealed itself. How? No one knows. Every door, every entrance, fused. No cracks, no hinges, just flat plaster, as if the space had never existed. But during demolition in the 1990s, a foreman named Brent Ryland swore he found a single brass doorknob embedded in a cinder block. It was ticking, rhythmic, and hot to the touch. He pried it loose, took it home. That night, every clock in his house shattered at once. No one's seen him since. Only the knob remained, melted into the shape of an hourglass with no sand. Danvers was built to hold the mad. But some places inside it unmade time itself. There's an unwritten rule in Danvers lore: never look directly into the eyes of room 407, because someone is always looking back. Room 407 was a standard patient isolation unit, 8x8 cell, steel bed frame, observation window, single flickering light. Records show it housed 43 different patients between 1952 and 1973. All of them died, except one, and he was never admitted. He was found, in the room, already sitting there, already staring, with black eyes, no whites, no irises, just liquid obsidian orbs that seemed to absorb light. When staff tried to question him, he didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't move. They called him the Watcher. Doctors assumed he was mute, deaf, blind, but when left alone with a nurse one evening, he whispered in a language that caused her to vomit blood. She said the syllables moved inside her skull, twisting memory and smell. After that, the room was sealed. But the black-eyed boy was still seen, not just by staff, by patients, in reflections, in corners of eyes, in the minds of the sedated, who screamed the same phrase in unison, he's drawing the door again. One janitor, cleaning near room 407, snapped a picture through the cracked window. The Polaroid? Just static. Until 3 days later. That's when it developed itself again. This time, it showed a perfectly clear photo of the janitor's dead mother standing in the room, holding her own severed head, eyes pitch black. The janitor gouged his eyes out with a pen and said, "Now I can't see him draw it." He died whispering, "It's almost finished." Then, one morning in 1973, room 407 was empty. The boy was gone, the bed untouched, but burned into the wall behind it, etched deep into the plaster, was an arched door, drawn in blood, not painted, drawn with a child's finger. A symbol hung over it, one no culture recognizes. But scholars later found the exact same symbol carved into a Sumerian tomb in Iraq, buried 6,000 years ago. Room 407 was bricked over, but sometimes people say they still see a child's shadow at the end of the corridor. Waiting, watching, sketching something on the wall with a finger that never stops bleeding. We've only begun. The madness at Danvers didn't begin in the patient wards. It started underground. Long before the first brick of the asylum was laid in 1874, the hill it sat on, Hawthorne Hill, was feared by locals. The Algonquian tribes refused to settle near it. Early Puritan settlers called it the Devil's Back. They said it hummed. When the asylum expanded in the 1930s, construction workers dug too deep beneath the original foundation. What they found wasn't clay, wasn't stone. It was carved bedrock, shaped into concentric rings and crude humanoid figures, kneeling, facing inward, mouths open. A secret room with no door, just a black hole in the center, 5 feet wide, lined with teeth. One worker, a young Italian named Emilio Rizzo, climbed in with a lantern. He never came out. The next day, workers heard a gurgling scream echo through the pipe system, and then every light in the building went dark for 5 full minutes. When they turned back on, every clock had stopped at 3:33 a.m. The hole was quickly sealed with concrete. But that didn't end it. That night, patients across all wards began chanting in unison, in a tongue no one recognized. Over 200 patients, all at once. A nurse scribbled what she heard phonetically. Matash Levethan, Matash Levethan. The mouth remembers, the mouth remembers. She was later found in the laundry chute, folded in half, face still repeating the chant, even in death. From then on, patients were forbidden from speaking during overnight hours. But every now and then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the pipes groaned, not from heat, not from pressure, but from something behind the walls, dragging its way upward. In the 1950s, a whistleblower psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Huxley, wrote an internal memo. What we unearthed beneath Danvers isn't physical madness. It's a consciousness, ancient and unsatisfied. We didn't build the asylum on cursed ground. The asylum was summoned to it. That memo was shredded, the doctor discharged. But on the last page, he wrote one final line. I fear it isn't imprisoned anymore. I fear it wears our skin now. And after he vanished, several staff reported seeing him in the halls, smiling, bleeding from the eyes, whispering, Matash la Vethin. Danvers wasn't a sanctuary for the insane. It was a temple, and every soul inside, a sacrifice. It was October 13th, 1963. A cold Sunday morning. Ward C at Danvers Asylum was unusually quiet. Too quiet. A nurse making morning rounds opened the main door expecting the usual screams, cries, and echoing mutters, but what she found was emptiness. Every single patient in Ward C, 42 men, was gone. Beds were still warm, food trays untouched, no signs of struggle, no footprints, no broken windows. Just one thing remained, a thick, copper-colored smear on the floor in the center of the hallway, a perfect spiral that ended at the sealed utility door leading into the basement. They unbolted it, found no one. But the air down there, it wasn't just cold, it pulled, like the very walls inhaled. Security assumed an escape, but here's what made no sense. All 42 doors had been locked from the outside. No windows were broken, no alarms had been triggered, no tunnels connected to the outside world. The official report claimed mass hysteria-fueled self-harm event, but the families never received bodies, just letters with vague phrases like beyond recovery or spiritually at peace. Then came the photographs. A new nurse, Elaine Harrow, reviewing patient files weeks later, noticed something chilling. She took the patient intake photo of a man named John Filkins, schizophrenic, delusional, age 43, and compared it to an old staff photo from 1911 found in the archives. There, behind the ward director, stood a man with the same crooked nose, same burn scar across his cheek, same dead gray eyes. Filkins hadn't vanished. He had always been there. Over the next few months, more vanishings followed. A janitor cleaning the east stairwell, a cook on his smoke break, a visiting priest. All gone, nothing left but spirals drawn in their rooms, sometimes in chalk, sometimes in nail scratches, and always at 3:33 a.m. Staff began whispering about the mouth, Alo, driving void beneath the asylum that fed on identity, erasing existence without a trace. A terrified intern once wrote in his journal, "It doesn't kill, it absorbs. You don't die here. You just become part of the architecture." By 1964, Ward C was permanently shut down. But during renovations in 1981, a construction team broke through the far wall. Behind it were 42 beds, neatly made, and 42 sets of clothes folded on the floor, all of them still warm. By 1965, it wasn't just patients disappearing. It was names. Orderlies who had worked the same shifts for years began staring blankly at staff rosters, unable to recognize their own handwriting. Nurses looked at one another and couldn't remember who had been there the day before. Worse, when they tried to recall, nosebleeds followed. A psychiatric resident, Dr. Benjamin Ames, documented this strange phenomenon in his private journal. "We are losing context, like we were never supposed to know each other. I look at Marlene, head nurse for 4 years, and I don't know her voice anymore." One morning, the director of psychiatry arrived to find an entire wing of staff had been replaced. No one remembered the originals, no resignation letters, no transfers, just unfamiliar faces with forged smiles and identical teeth. They all introduced themselves with first names only, no surnames, no histories. And when asked how long they'd been working there, the response was always Long enough. Paranoia infected the halls like mold in the walls. Staff began marking their arms with initials every morning, a crude attempt to remember who they were. But even those letters began shifting. Amy became Anna. Jacob became Jared. Then just Jay. One nurse refused to sleep, terrified that if she did, she'd wake up with a different face in the mirror. She was found in the break room 2 days later, staring into a teacup and muttering, "The tea knows who I am. No one else does. No one else can." Eventually, even the asylum's blueprints began changing. Hallways shifted overnight. The east stairwell now led to an old chapel that had never existed, complete with broken pews and a crumbling altar soaked in what looked like dried ink or blood. A priest was called in to cleanse the chapel. He began Mass at 2 a.m. By 2:07, he was gone. The doors were still locked from the inside. His final note, scribbled in Latin, was found nailed to the pulpit. Vox edifici sum, qui me audierit, obliviscatur. I am the voice of the building. All who hear me shall forget. After that, Danvers stopped hiring new staff altogether, because the ones who remained didn't remember applying. In November 1970, under a cold, sunless sky, a woman was delivered to Danvers State Hospital by 2 men in unmarked uniforms. She wore no shoes, no coat, just a paper-thin hospital gown and eyes that looked older than time itself. Her name, scrawled hastily on her intake form, was Eleanor Marsh, but every time someone addressed her by that name, she whispered, "That's not who I am. That's who I was," before it called me back. Eleanor had no known family, no medical history, and no criminal record. No fingerprints in any system. Yet she spoke fluent Latin, Aramaic, and a language no one recognized, one that sounded wet, like it was never meant for a human tongue. She wasn't violent, but she knew things. She recited the layout of the building in exact detail, including wings that had been sealed off since the 1920s. She described staff members' deepest fears without ever speaking to them, and she refused to sleep. For 8 nights, she paced the corners of her room, drawing symbols on the walls with her fingernails. When asked why, she answered simply, "It wakes up when we forget." Doctors prescribed sedatives, but none worked. She remained upright, alert, until the 9th night, when she finally collapsed from exhaustion. That's when the screaming began. Not from Eleanor, but from every other patient in the building. Simultaneously, security footage from that night showed static, except for one camera outside Eleanor's room. At precisely 3:13 a.m., she sat up in bed and whispered a single word. "Open." Every locked door in the East Wing, bolted for decades, swung open with a creak in unison. Guards found her room empty, but in her place lay a bundle of patient files, old and yellowed, belonging to individuals who had never been recorded in any hospital ledger. Each file ended with the same cryptic note, typed on a Remington machine. Condition irreversible, Hote. Set remembers the architecture. Terminate before the structure becomes sentient. Danvers was no longer a hospital. It was a library of broken minds, and Eleanor had just returned a book no one remembered borrowing. When Danvers State Hospital was finally closed in 1992, no one expected what lay beneath it. Officially, the land was to be cleared for redevelopment. Condos, they said, new beginnings. But when demolition crews began tearing through the East Wing's substructure, they hit something unnatural. It wasn't stone. It wasn't steel. It was older than either. The foundation did not give way like concrete or brick. It cracked like bone, hollow, resonant, and lined with strange etchings no archaeologist could identify. Beneath the infirmary basement, where records claimed only piping and crawl space should exist, workers discovered a chamber, a circular, vaulted catacomb that stretched much farther than the property lines allowed. It wasn't built. It was grown, organic, pulsing. The walls were warm to the touch and bore repeating symbols carved in spirals, each spiraling inward to a central pit, a gaping well that breathed in silence. At its edge lay hundreds of discarded medical files, names and numbers going back to the 1800s. Most ended in the same phrase Eleanor's files did. Host remembers the architecture. Terminate before structure becomes sentient. But this time, one was different. It bore no patient name, only a typewritten line. Sentience achieved. Phase 1 complete. Human recall initiated. Then, one of the workers screamed. He said he'd heard a whisper from inside the pit, something ancient, fluid, syllables that sounded like dripping blood and gasping breath. Another man followed a soft humming and vanished. They found his flashlight, but not his body. The chamber was sealed within the hour. But the most disturbing part, a camera drone lowered into the shaft for inspection, captured 2 seconds of footage before its feed cut out. Just enough time to show a hand, pale, spindly with 6 fingers, reaching from the darkness. After that, the land was declared contaminated and off-limits. But the housing project went forward anyway. Condos were built directly over the catacomb, with tenants complaining of scratching under the floorboards, dreams in dead languages, and a sense that the building was remembering them. Danvers wasn't demolished. It transformed. It buried itself inside the homes and minds of the living. It started as a whisper. From Danvers to Pennhurst, from Waverly Hills to Trenton State, across institutions long shuttered and forgotten, patients began drawing the same thing, the spiral. It wasn't just coincidence. These were isolated cases, locked in silence, many nonverbal for decades, and yet, out of nowhere, they all began sketching the exact same spiral, perfectly proportioned, always spinning inward, always ending in a jagged black core. Some scratched it into their walls with fingernails, others used blood. But the spiral wasn't just a shape. It was a map, and the more researchers tried to ignore it, the more the phenomena grew. Doctors at Oregon State Hospital documented a disturbing trend in 1996. Catatonic patients whispering Eleanor in their sleep. Some even answered to the name, claiming they used to be her. Used to be. Like it was a role they had played. Like Eleanor was an idea. A virus. And just like a virus, it mutated. Within months, reports flooded in, recovered tapes where patients would speak in unison during thunderstorms. Entire wards waking at 3:13 a.m. with nosebleeds and spontaneous bruises, arms arranged like they were reaching for something underground. The spirals returned, on mirrors, inside pill bottles, even carved into linoleum floors. And with them came that same phrase from Danvers. Host remembers the architecture. What did it mean? Why were broken minds across the nation suddenly speaking like a hive? In 1997, an experimental psych unit at St. Elmo's in Michigan conducted a risky test. They showed a group of schizophrenic patients archived footage of Danvers's demolished East Wing. Every single subject, regardless of diagnosis, began screaming the same sentence: "We were there when it was born." No one knew what it was. But someone, or something, was pulling memories across time, across minds, across death. It's ELF. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a key, and it had opened a door inside every asylum, every corridor, every mind that had ever forgotten itself. It started as a whisper. From Danvers to Pennhurst, from Waverly Hills to Trenton State, across institutions long shuttered and forgotten, patients began drawing the same thing, the spiral. It wasn't just coincidence. These were isolated cases, locked in silence, many nonverbal for decades, and yet, out of nowhere, they all began sketching the exact same spiral, perfectly proportioned, always spinning inward, always ending in a jagged black core. Some scratched it into their walls with fingernails, others used blood. But the spiral wasn't just a shape, it was a map, and the more researchers tried to ignore it, the more the phenomena grew. Doctors at Oregon State Hospital documented a disturbing trend in 1996, catatonic patients whispering Eleanor in their sleep. Some even answered to the name, claiming they used to be her, used to be. Like it was a role they had played, like Eleanor was an idea, a virus. And just like a virus, it mutated. Within months, reports flooded in, recovered tapes where patients would speak in unison during thunderstorms, entire wards waking at 3:13 a.m. with nosebleeds and spontaneous bruises, arms arranged like they were reaching for something underground. The spirals returned, on mirrors, inside pill bottles, even carved into linoleum floors. And with them came that same phrase from Danvers, "Host remembers the architecture." What did it mean? Why were broken minds across the nation suddenly speaking like a hive? In 1997, an experimental psych unit at St. Elmo's in Michigan conducted a risky test. They showed a group of schizophrenic patients archived footage of Danvers's demolished East Wing. Every single subject, regardless of diagnosis, began screaming the same sentence, "We were there when it was born." No one knew what it was, but someone or something was pulling memories across time, across minds, across death. It's ELF. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a key, and it had opened a door inside every asylum, every corridor, every mind that had ever forgotten itself. It started as a whisper. From Danvers to Pennhurst, from Waverly Hills to Trenton State, across institutions long shuttered and forgotten, patients began drawing the same thing, the spiral. It wasn't just coincidence. These were isolated cases, locked in silence, many nonverbal for decades, and yet, out of nowhere, they all began sketching the exact same spiral, perfectly proportioned, always spinning inward, always ending in a jagged black core. Some scratched it into their walls with fingernails, others used blood. But the spiral wasn't just a shape, it was a map, and the more researchers tried to ignore it, the more the phenomena grew. Doctors at Oregon State Hospital documented a disturbing trend in 1996, catatonic patients whispering Eleanor in their sleep. Some even answered to the name, claiming they used to be her, used to be. Like it was a role they had played, like Eleanor was an idea, a virus. And just like a virus, it mutated. Within months, reports flooded in, recovered tapes where patients would speak in unison during thunderstorms, entire wards waking at 3:13 a.m. with nosebleeds and spontaneous bruises, arms arranged like they were reaching for something underground. The spirals returned, on mirrors, inside pill bottles, even carved into linoleum floors. And with them came that same phrase from Danvers, "Host remembers the architecture." What did it mean? Why were broken minds across the nation suddenly speaking like a hive? In 1997, an experimental psych unit at St. Elmo's in Michigan conducted a risky test. They showed a group of schizophrenic patients archived footage of Danvers's demolished East Wing. Every single subject, regardless of diagnosis, began screaming the same sentence, "We were there when it was born." No one knew what it was, but someone or something was pulling memories across time, across minds, across death. It's ELF. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a key, and it had opened a door inside every asylum, every corridor, every mind that had ever forgotten itself. It started as a whisper. From Danvers to Pennhurst, from Waverly Hills to Trenton State, across institutions long shuttered and forgotten, patients began drawing the same thing, the spiral. It wasn't just coincidence. These were isolated cases, locked in silence, many nonverbal for decades, and yet, out of nowhere, they all began sketching the exact same spiral, perfectly proportioned, always spinning inward, always ending in a jagged black core. Some scratched it into their walls with fingernails, others used blood. But the spiral wasn't just a shape, it was a map, and the more researchers tried to ignore it, the more the phenomena grew. Doctors at Oregon State Hospital documented a disturbing trend in 1996, catatonic patients whispering Eleanor in their sleep. Some even answered to the name, claiming they used to be her, used to be. Like it was a role they had played, like Eleanor was an idea, a virus. And just like a virus, it mutated. Within months, reports flooded in, recovered tapes where patients would speak in unison during thunderstorms. Entire wards waking at 3:13 a.m. with nosebleeds and spontaneous bruises, arms arranged like they were reaching for something underground. The spirals returned, on mirrors, inside pill bottles, even carved into linoleum floors. And with them came that same phrase from Danvers, "Host remembers the architecture." What did it mean? Why were broken minds across the nation suddenly speaking like a hive? In 1997, an experimental psych unit at St. Elmo's in Michigan conducted a risky test. They showed a group of schizophrenic patients archived footage of Danvers's demolished East Wing. Every single subject, regardless of diagnosis, began screaming the same sentence, "We were there when it was born." No one knew what it was. But someone, or something, was pulling memories across time, across minds, across death. It's ELF. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a key, and it had opened a door inside every asylum, every corridor, every mind that had ever forgotten itself. It started as a whisper. From Danvers to Pennhurst, from Waverly Hills to Trenton State, across institutions long shuttered and forgotten, patients began drawing the same thing, the spiral. It wasn't just coincidence. These were isolated cases, locked in silence, many nonverbal for decades, and yet, out of nowhere, they all began sketching the exact same spiral, perfectly proportioned, always spinning inward, always ending in a jagged black core. Some scratched it into their walls with fingernails, others used blood. But the spiral wasn't just a shape, it was a map, and the more researchers tried to ignore it, the more the phenomena grew. Doctors at Oregon State Hospital documented a disturbing trend in 1996, catatonic patients whispering Eleanor in their sleep. Some even answered to the name, claiming they used to be her, used to be. Like it was a role they had played, like Eleanor was an idea, a virus. And just like a virus, it mutated. Within months, reports flooded in, recovered tapes where patients would speak in unison during thunderstorms. Entire wards waking at 3:13 a.m. with nosebleeds and spontaneous bruises, arms arranged like they were reaching for something underground. The spirals returned, on mirrors, inside pill bottles, even carved into linoleum floors. And with them came that same phrase from Danvers, "Host remembers the architecture." What did it mean? Why were broken minds across the nation suddenly speaking like a hive? In 1997, an experimental psych unit at St. Elmo's in Michigan conducted a risky test. They showed a group of schizophrenic patients archived footage of Danvers's demolished East Wing. Every single subject, regardless of diagnosis, began screaming the same sentence, "We were there when it was born." No one knew what it was. But someone, or something, was pulling memories across time, across minds, across death. It's ELF. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a key, and it had opened a door inside every asylum, every corridor, every mind that had ever forgotten itself.